everybody. I am Ruth Abbey. I am your Zoom host for today, and I will be kind of facilitating and introducing the speakers. Actually, Amos did a great job of describing our session, and we're running a little bit behind time, so I think we can just go ahead and launch right in. This carbon sequestration and carbon farming workshop has really been an exciting opportunity for us to present something that not all folks who are active in climate action issues are familiar with. So we've brought in some real experts in the field. And so first up, Ben, I'm just going to put you on the spot. Ben Weiss is with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District, and resource conservation districts are a little bit of a hidden gem in terms of what they do, how they function. Counties have them. And Ben is going to talk to us about what they're doing in the area of carbon sequestration. So Ben, are you able to go ahead and share your screen?
And I'll say before I start that if I speak too fast or you want me to slow down or I freeze up or anything, please feel free to stop me and ask me to say something again. While I'm doing this, my wife is Zoom teaching calculus over in the other room. So we may be pushing the limits of our bandwidth here, but it'll probably be all right. So hi, everyone. My name is Ben Weiss. I'm with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District, and I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about what resource conservation districts are and then the role we're playing in carbon farming. Let me go here. So what are resource conservation districts? We've been around for about 75 years. We were incorporated back in the early 40s. Contra Costa RCD specifically was incorporated in 1941. And we came about kind of as a result of the farming practices and management practices that resulted in the Dust Bowl. So we came about in the 40s to really work with farmers and ranchers to kind of turn around what was going on their properties and build soil health and do all sorts of good work there. Over the last 70 years, our mission hasn't really changed. Our programming has changed. But for the most part, we're still out there doing good conservation work. There's something like, I think this map here, well, this map here does show all of the resource conservation districts throughout the state. There's something like 90 of them. Unfortunately, I think San Francisco does not have one, but you are served by 9 Bay Area counties that each have one too. So I have some contact information at the end if you want to learn more about the RCDs. But by and large, if you live in California, you probably have an RCD working in your area. So feel free to check them out, hit them up. Yeah. So a little bit more about our resource conservation district and resource conservation districts in general. So we are made up of a voluntary board of directors. They are not paid. You can see our 5 board of directors here. These are all just volunteers in Contra Costa County that have various histories in conservation. They get appointed by our county board of supervisors, and they're tasked with leading and overseeing our resource conservation district. So we ultimately report to them. But again, these are just people that are passionate about the environment and conservation and want to see it in their communities be strengthened. So then below is a nice little staff picture from about a year ago. We're actually up to now, I believe currently we have 12 staff members, 10 of which are program staff, and then an executive director and an office administrator. And we kind of split the work up. We do all sorts of good stuff working in, myself, I work more in the agricultural realm. So I work a lot with farmers and ranchers, but we also have staff on board that are doing watershed stewardship education and helping clean up creeks and do restoration projects throughout Contra Costa County. We're multifaceted. I guess with resource conservation districts in general, since we are locally focused, each resource conservation district is a little different. We largely respond to what the conservation needs of our community are. And here in Contra Costa, for instance, we have a lot of work. We have a lot of private land sitting against creeks that we try to manage that. So we work a lot with private landowners, but then we also have a pretty significant ag portion. We have about, I think it's 13,000 acres of row crops, and then about another 170,000 acres of rangeland across private ranches, East Bay Parkland, SFPUC land down in Alameda County, Mount Diablo, and then also some land trusts. So we got a lot of stuff going on in Contra Costa County, but what you'll find that our RCD does may not be what another RCD does. So then to talk a little bit more about my specific program at the RCD, I run the Agriculture Conservation Program, and we have a lot of different elements to that program. I'll go over just a few of them today, but then really get into carbon farm planning. So one of the bigger issues that we deal with in Contra Costa County, and I'm sure elsewhere, is illegal dumping. You can see on the picture on the right here, someone gifted this farmer what appears to be a sofa sectional set. So we work with farmers to get that off their land so that way that's not degrading into our soil and into our water and eventually into the bay. We also work a lot with the ranchers on improving their rangeland conditions, as you can see from this cow up in the top left corner. So we work with them to address some of the resource concerns they have, but then also protect a lot of the endangered species that also make up our rangelands. So we are able to voluntarily partner with these ranchers for the good of all the species that make use of this land. We also just kind of provide conservation technical assistance. We frequently go out to talk with farmers and ranchers about what they've got going on. You know, they'll call us up and say, hey, you know, I'm having a weed problem on the edge of my field. What can I do? You know, what are the safe ways to get rid of this? What's the most environmentally effective ways? Sometimes they may want to do things like attract more pollinators. You know, really, we answer the call and whatever that is. And if we don't know the answer, we do our best to find it. So we like to think ourselves as a great resource. So definitely check us out and other RCDs around the state. So to get into the meat of why we're all here today is to talk about carbon farm planning and carbon farming. The first question we get is, what is carbon farming? And to that, I would say all farmers are carbon farmers. Ultimately, what we're trying to do with carbon farming, or what carbon farming is, right? It's just regular farming. We're putting stuff into the ground, taking atmospheric CO2, converting it into plant matter, and then also sequestering it down into the soil. What we do through the carbon farm planning process, and what we as an RCD are trying to do, is we're trying to increase that carbon farm, increase that sequestration from the atmosphere down into the soil. So we work with farmers and ranchers to really identify management practices that are going to address some of the natural resource concerns they have on their property, but in a way that's also going to result in more carbon sequestration. We have a list, I think it's at this point probably 30 or 40 management practices that will address a whole host of different problems ongoing, but also be sequestering that carbon. So these are a list of just some of these practices. Most of these are plant-based. So things like, you know, establishing a cover crop system over the winter, so that way you're growing something on the ground in the winter and you're just not letting the barren soil sit there and erode because of wind and rain, but you're actually putting something on the ground that is going to build soil health. Another popular carbon farm or carbon farm management practice would be hedgerows, which you can see off on the right there. You'll find these on the edges of fields as a means to provide maybe some pollinator habitat to help pollinate some of your crops, but at the same time, it's also going to be sequestering carbon. Other popular ones, you might get windbreaks or shelter belts, a great way to reduce wind erosion, especially I live out here in Oakley, and down where most of our agriculture is out in Brentwood. It can get pretty windy out there at times. So we can set up these windbreaks to reduce wind erosion of soil, but at the same time, you know, now we're planting trees that are actually going to sequester carbon. So kind of that win-win for everyone involved. Another big one that you'll hear about today is mulching and compost application. You know, we work with farmers to build soil health, put more carbon in the ground, attract more beneficial microbes and all sorts of good stuff to build that soil health for more productive farms and higher yields and all sorts of good stuff. So to talk a little bit more about what this planning process looks like, you can see on the top right here, this photo, this is the NRCS process for conservation planning. So if I don't know if I covered this yet, the NRCS is the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're a branch of the US Department of Agriculture, and they are probably our biggest partner. We actually share office space with them in Contra Costa, and I believe most other RCEs share office space with them across the state. But our missions, so to speak, are pretty much in line to work with farmers to help people help the land. So through the conservation planning process, the NRCS works with these farmers to you know, take an inventory of what they've got on their property, identify problems that we can help solve, you know, create alternatives, maybe other ways to go about solving that problem if something's not going to take. ultimately make the decision which one we're going to go after, implement, and then monitor to make sure that it's actually sticking around and doing what we want it to do. So what carbon farm planning does is it takes that conservation planning process and then just shifts it ever slightly. And we look instead through the lens of how can we increase carbon sequestration while also achieving the same management practices. So again, like we talked about, we're still addressing these problems that are on a farm or a ranch, like lack of pollinator habitat, lack of healthy soil, we're trying to reduce nutrient use or something like that. And instead kind of focus it to shift more of, okay, what practices can we address those problems with, but are also going to be sequestering carbon. And then we also use a whole suite of tools. I'll mention Comet Planner down here. It's a great tool developed by the NRCS, and I believe it's Colorado State University. It actually, they did a bunch of research and were able to quantify how much a management practice will result in carbon sequestration. So we use that to calculate what we're doing. And then ArcGIS is another great tool that we use. So then back in 2018, we actually wrapped up the first carbon farm plan here in Contra, Costa County, out at Frog Hollow Farm in Brentwood, California. You can see a little bit of what this plan looks like. It's a pretty heady document, probably about 30 or 40 pages, so I didn't want to share the whole thing. But I instead took out just what the carbon beneficial practice table would look. So this is ultimately what we found through working with them, what we thought that their carbon sequestration potential could be if they fully implemented all of the practices that we talked about. So we talked about prescribed grazing, because they are primarily an orchard system, but they do have a lot of biomass that they wanted to get rid of, and they were sick of using weed whackers and a bunch of manual labor to clean things up. So we kind of threw a prescribed grazing in there to maybe do a little rotational grazing system to get goats in there to eat some of the weeds down, and what some of those benefits would be. They have compost on site and they wanted to better utilize that. So we talked a little bit about that. They also wanted to do some hedgerow plantings. And then I don't think I made it on here actually, but they wanted to increase some of the cover cropping that they were talking about. So all told, you can see here that if they fully built out all of these management practices, over a year, we estimate that they would sequester about 109 tons of CO2e, which is a really great amount. Now you kind of extrapolate that out across the 13,000 acres of other agricultural land we have. This farm is about 240 acres, I believe. So there's a lot of potential to continue to do this work. It's great work, and I'm excited to be doing it. Then kind of where are we at now? So it is a little expensive to do these carbon farm plannings. We don't charge the farmers for them. Instead, we go out and we fundraise. We're doing grant collecting, or we're writing grants. We're going after donors. We're seeking all sorts of funds to write this. It takes, on average, probably between 2 to 4 months to write one of these carbon farm plans. We really get into it. Multiple site visits where it's a very iterative process. It's not something, we just walk up and say, hey, do this, this, and this. It's a whole feedback. And we want to kind of see how the farm changes over time too. So that's where we're at now. It's just trying to find more money for our time in order to write this. We've also been working with a group called Hack the Bay and Delta, which I think some people might actually be here from that. It's a new thing for us. I think that's John that actually spoke up. That's John at Hack the Bay. So what we're trying to do is partner more with some of the tech world. That's something we haven't done as an RCD, and see how these guys who know nothing about our RCD and know nothing about our program can help us kind of reshape it and look at it and see, maybe where some of the weaknesses or some of the other things that we can hack, so to speak. We're trying to expand carbon farming. That's our team that we're working on. As well, we're just trying to build carbon farm awareness, which is why I'm here today. And then the last step, which I'll let someone else talk about, is actually implementing some of these carbon farm practices. I believe that's, yeah. So then if you have more to learn, or if you want to learn more about carbon farming, here is all of the Bay Area resource conservation districts and the various people that you can contact to learn more about what's going on maybe in your particular county. If you want to learn more, I'm at Contra Costa RCD. So there's my phone and email. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. Although I will note that I'm going to be going on paternity leave here in about a week or two. So forgive me if I don't answer your emails. But feel free to reach out to any of these other folks on here. They're all great people. I work with them. we're doing this all up and down the state, and you probably didn't learn about it. So, but now you do. Now you know about it. And that's my presentation. So I'll hand it back to you, Ruth.
Ben, that's awesome. Whew. I think we wanted to give an opportunity for folks, if you have any questions specifically for Ben, we can take a little pause right now and Ben can answer some questions.
Yeah.
And I think you can possibly just unmute and go ahead and ask.
Yeah, and I'll give a quick plug for Kiss the Ground. We're actually going to be doing a screening of Kiss the Ground through our RCD here on November 5th, I believe, from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. We'll probably have that up on our website here. We're still working out some of the details on the invite and how to register and all that, but we'd love to have you. Even if you don't join us, it's a great Netflix documentary talking a lot about these carbon farm practices that I'm recommending out here. It's also known as regenerative agriculture, kind of the same idea of building a healthier farm and a healthier ecosystem.
So Ben, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
My name's Sheila and I'm the one that mentioned the documentary. I was so moved by seeing that recently with someone I'm actually working with through the Department of Environment in San Francisco who uses American Sign Language and is deaf, and I grew up in signing families. And so we're actually trying to work with deaf community leaders in this country and worldwide to prepare them and have them help. So my question is, what you're talking about, because I saw the documentary, are you connected directly to that network in the in the documentary?
Not directly. That's something, I only learned about the Kiss the Ground documentary maybe about a month ago now. I would say I may be connected to it, but it's not immediately apparent to me.
And may I ask how long you've been involved in this particular specialty that you're describing to me?
Yeah, I've been working
a therapist who got into climate, a couple of years ago by accident. So
yeah, I've been working with the Resource Conservation District now for it'll be 4 years in January. And as long as I've been here, we've been doing carbon farming. I know that in the RCD world, carbon farming is our bread and butter, I would say. There's a lot of RCDs doing this work, but not all of us yet. So we're still trying to get all of the work out there. But I'd say it's really been our focus probably since 2015 or 16, if I had to guess. So it's relatively new to us and we're still building relationships, but yeah, only going up.
Hi, I got a question. This is Michael Simonitis with Wastebusters. And I'm curious about the issuance of carbon credits for carbon farming. And I've used the Comet Planner a little bit and seen it generate information about how much you could be earning with carbon credits. So are the RCDs helping these farmers get paid for carbon credits, and what is the mechanism for that?
I would say that that has certainly been a topic of conversation amongst the RCDs. I don't know if we are the ones equipped to be in that market or the transactional authority between these farmers and these markets. I know that a lot of these management practices too will take some time before they really get into it and really are, I guess, would be fine-tuned. That's about all I can say at the moment. I know that, like I said, there's been conversations about it, but I think there are a couple other organizations that may be doing it. I think actually when we talked just the other week, there may be someone looking at this, but I would say it's not really in our wheelhouse, so to speak, to connect these guys.
Well, I'd like to just encourage you all and everyone on this call to reach out to the California Air Resources Board Task Force. They're currently considering the different approved practices to earn carbon credits through the California Air Board and the California Carbon Market. And carbon farming is one of the things that they're considering, but right now they're saying it's about $200 per acre to implement, which is cost prohibitive. But thanks to 1383 and cities needing to buy compost, I think there's a great opportunity here to expand the carbon farming there and get farmers paid for doing so.
Yeah. And then I've got another question here. I'm sorry, I don't know your first name from C. I'm hoping to say this right. Legger. He was asking about, or she, I don't know. I was asking about how much of our funding is from grants. So On the whole, like I said, each RCD is a little different, so it's hard to say. We are one of the lucky RCDs in the state that we get a small sliver of our local property tax. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's something like 0.08% of the 1%, which I think works out to about $200,000 or so. That mostly covers a lot of our operating fees and keeping the building open. By and large, we are grant and contract funded. I think our budget is on the order of, it's approaching maybe about $1 million annually. So 800,000 of that is coming from grants and contracts that we're able to go out and find. So RCDs kind of exist in a weird nebulous space between local government and non-environmental nonprofit. Yeah, so mostly grant funded. Thanks for the question. And then Kent, I think you have a question if you want to unmute.
Yeah, hey, Ben, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. We spoke before about the 85,000 or so acres that are already under conservation as part of the East Bay Regional Park District. I'm wondering if your score sheet or process would apply to a program, like those rangelands, and the magnitude of carbon to go from where I estimate that rangeland currently is at about 30% of its potential up to 80 or 90% would be I think the largest project in the two-county area, in the Alameda and Contra Costa County area.
So Trevor, are you going to talk about that in your presentation? I don't want to do that. Go ahead.
I will give it a mention, but mostly I'll connect it to a project that Stop Waste is doing at a property out in the Altamont Hills, and how we're trying to build confidence in other public agencies to do similar projects.
Yeah, I would say that that's where we're at. And I definitely see the potential out there on our rangelands to do some of this work, get into some areas and do some strong riparian restoration. That's a really big positive in terms of carbon sequestration. There's a lot of potential there, especially on our rangelands, as well as better managing our rangelands. That's something we're constantly doing with the East Bay Parks. They are a big partner of ours. We do a lot of rangeland conservation with them. So yeah, to answer your question, there is a lot of potential out there, and we're slowly chipping away and trying to get it to work.
And I would guess that East Bay Mud may be number 2.
Yep, exactly. In Contra Costa County, I believe, yeah, East Bay Mud, East Bay Parks, and then it kind of trails off there. Mount Diablo has some, the state park, and then various land trusts like the John Muir Land Trust, the Save Mount Diablo. I'm probably going to forget a few, but yeah, these are all great project partners that we've worked with, and we'll continue to work with and see where we can do this important work there too.
Well, exciting work that you're doing, Ben, and thank you so much for being so articulate and sharing it all. It's very cool. Let's go ahead and have Trevor present. So Trevor is with Stop Waste, and he is doing some really exciting carbon farming projects specifically for folks, doing it in their own backyard. And I will let you kind of explain the whole program, Trevor, because it's such an interesting story about what all is going on at Stop Waste. So go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. And like Ben had said before, if you folks are having a hard time hearing me, let me know. So my name is Trevor Probert. I'm a community outreach coordinator at Stop Waste. Stop Waste is a public agency that serves communities of Alameda County on waste reduction and sustainability goals. And I specifically provide education to county residents on the benefits of using compost and mulch, building healthy soil, and then now most recently, this potential around carbon farming. And so we've approached carbon farming outreach by building relationships with urban farms and other community organizations that work around the food cycle. And we've had the hope of building capacity in these organizations to help them become emerging champions of local carbon farming, especially in urban areas like Alameda County. And so we've also developed some tools and resources for residents to engage with carbon farming as well. And I'm going to share about all that just right now. So a little bit of context, and this connects to what Ben had just talked about. So Stop Waste has a carbon farming plan written for a 1,200 acre property out in the Altamont Hills. The plan was written by the Alameda County Resource Conservation District, and the implementation of that plan began in December of 2019 where we applied the compost to the first 10 acres of the project. Depending on circumstances with COVID, this winter we plan to apply compost to another 100+ acres. This project was modeled based on the Marin Carbon Project back in 2010, which raised the attention between the connection of compost application and carbon sequestration. And at that project, they measured just a single 1/2-inch compost application caused rangeland soils to sequester up to 1.5 metric tons of carbon dioxide per acre. And they estimated that if that scaled up to across half of California's rangeland, that could sequester the same amount of emissions of California's entire commercial and residential energy use. So it's no small amount of carbon sequestration that could happen on California rangeland. But at Stop Waste, I bring all this up because we have a largely urban residential audience, and so we have been asking ourselves the question: how can we introduce carbon farming to an urban residential audience here in the county? So we decided to center our outreach around urban farms because they are models of carbon farming practices. And if we could demonstrate that these urban farms were sequestering carbon in their soil, then they could become champions of carbon farming when they are interacting with their community members. And we were really intentional about working with urban farms because they are providing a bunch of services, includes donating produce to food banks, providing job training programs, providing K-12 garden education. Some of them are building vegetable gardens for new and existing homes and apartments. Nearly all of them have active volunteer groups. They're hosting their own gardening workshops year-round. And they just generally have ample opportunities to partner and network with other community organizations that work around the food cycle and the local food economy. And so to help build the capacity of these urban farms, we've done a few things. The first thing is we've been providing soil testing to specifically measure carbon sequestration to help give some clarity to the farms and the folks working at the farms about the impacts of their carbon farming practices. The second thing is we've provided on-site composting technical assistance to help solidify these farms as local composting experts. They're already huge advocates of using compost, but not all the farms were actually composting on site. Many of them were purchasing compost. So the compost technical assistance was to just provide them some new tools and expertise around compost. We've also been co-hosting workshops with these farms to invite and introduce residents to these local models of urban carbon farming. And then we've been cross-promoting and connecting the farms with other organizations in the local food economy, which is just taking off right now. I feel like there's a lot of momentum building around a local regenerative food economy. A little bit of a snapshot of the data that we've been finding through our soil testing program. Soil testing was our approach to try to invest these urban farms in carbon farming with the intent to build a case for urban carbon farming using local soil data, because the truth was there just was not a lot of carbon farming data that referenced urban soils that we could use. So far the results from the soil testing have really confirmed for the farms the benefits that they've been getting out of using these regenerative carbon farming practices rather than conventional practices. So we've partnered with 8 farms for the soil testing project. It's a 3-year timeline. We're in our 3rd and final year of testing right now. We test for soil carbon at 3 different depths. And each year of testing is paired with compost donation for the farm. And we also track all the other carbon farming practices that the farms utilize. Due to COVID, I will say that the labs have delayed getting some of the data back to us, but I do have multiple years of data from one farm in particular, Fremont Leaf's Stone Garden, that I can share here. The image on the left shows the depths that we sampled to. And and on the right there, you'll see how we've measured the percentage of soil carbon increased every year at those 3 different depths. And the increases in the deeper layers of the soil is the most important pattern that we want to see for long-term carbon sequestration. And when I calculate out these percentages using the bulk density of the soil at each of those depths, we can calculate out that Fremont Leaf stored about 47 metric tons of carbon dioxide over 1 acre between the years of 2018 and 2020. and that roughly equals the same amount of emissions of 9 cars in 1 year. This data is definitely on the high end of some of the data that's coming out, but Fremont Leaf is a very huge advocate of using multiple carbon farming practices. They're proud of the fact of that they are sequestering this much carbon in their soil and all the co-benefits that it brings for their soil health. And they really are making a point of it to share that with their audience in becoming a champion of carbon farming. That's the model that we're trying to build here in Alameda County with these urban farms. Because there's such a correlation between using compost and carbon farming, we wanted to assist the farms even further by developing an on-farm composting toolkit, which is a really in-depth guide for small and mid-scale composters. We've also been working with the Alameda County Resource Conservation District to share the toolkit more widely with other farms, even farms that Stop Waste doesn't necessarily have relationships with. And we've also been trying to share this with other resource conservation districts statewide that are providing technical assistance for the California Healthy Soils Program and the carbon farm planning that Ben had talked about. And it also seems that the Resource Conservation District will be able to help us create a Spanish language translation, which is a really key step for equitable access. So that is an exciting part. And this toolkit and all the other resources that I'll be sharing today, they're all free, available on our website. We introduce residents to the farms through co-hosting public workshops. In the past, they've always been in person, and now things have been moved online and virtual. We teach gardening workshops year-round, and we found that soil health has been a really important bridging concept for explaining carbon farming to home gardeners, because folks at home, they have a really wide range of knowledge and understanding about climate change and carbon sequestration, but for the most part, everyone understands the value of healthy soil for whatever reason that they're gardening at home. And in general, residents seem to be really impressed with the health of the soil at these urban farms, and especially when they discover the fact that the health of the soil has been built up over time with carbon farming practices. A lot of the farms started in kind of dire circumstances. The soil wasn't all that healthy. And so it helps change home gardeners' mindsets about the fact that their own soil's health is dynamic rather than static and can be improved upon. These workshops are also a great opportunity to share the soil data with residents and kind of get their reactions and feedbacks to the data and give them a real reference to local carbon farming and ensure that these residents can be carbon farmers even as home gardeners. And when the residents are introduced to the urban farms, we've found that they're joining their mailing lists, their volunteer teams, they're participating in CSAs and plant sales that are hosted by the farm, they're attending community events, and they have a relationship now with a model of carbon farming in their neighborhood. And we also use the workshops as an opportunity to introduce city climate action plans and also inform them about upcoming city level impacts of SB 1383, which I'll be mentioning in a little bit here. So Ben showed a list of carbon farming practices. And what we've done is we've sort of distilled down the practices that are most relevant to home gardeners. And we covered these practices in our most widespread resource, Tools for Building Healthy Soil, which is shown on the right, also available and free to download. Another resource that we've recently developed is the Healthy Soils Activity Guide. And we developed this resource because carbon farming, especially for home gardeners, can feel like an invisible process. It's mostly happening within plants and underground and the soil ecosystem. And it's also impractical for most home gardeners to do soil testing. So we developed this tool to help make it more visible. The resource teaches home gardeners 8 soil activities that help them observe various aspects of their soil health, all in connection with organic matter and carbon. And ultimately, we want the home gardeners to treat their soil more like carbon farmers would. So there needs to be some level of exploration and learning about their own soil health. And this activity guide attempts to be a resource to do that. The audience for this resource is not just home gardeners and urban farmers, but also educators. All of these activities are very family friendly, and we are working with our schools team at Stop Waste to help try to make it more accessible for schools, and educators. There are a lot of pressure points for communities in Alameda County to help advance urban carbon farming. These are just a few of them. First of all, and I'm sure it's going to be talked about throughout this summit, is most cities in Alameda County have completed updating their climate action plans. Nearly all the cities have included soil carbon sequestration or carbon farming as an action step. That's huge that it is put in writing somewhere so that residents can point to it when they're talking with their cities. There's also a lot of public land that would make really great carbon farming sites for compost application. That includes city landscapes, parks, even turf and sport fields. And we are hoping that our carbon farming project out in the Altamont Hills can help build confidence in some of these other public agencies like East Bay Regional Parks, like regional water districts, folks that are holding on to larger properties and engage them in carbon farm planning. There has in the past been some hesitation to use compost because there's been a misunderstanding that compost is like a fertilizer, and people have been worried that fertilizers can cause eutrophication in waterways, and we're trying to demonstrate at our carbon farming project through measuring runoff data and other things, and trying to solidify that no, compost is nothing like a nitrogen fertilizer and does not cause those same issues with waterways, and in fact can improve the health of those waterways. So we're really trying to help build confidence around the use of compost and carbon farming planning. I mentioned SB 1383. For folks unfamiliar with the bill, it was passed a couple years ago. It's the short-lived climate pollutant strategy, and it requires the diversion of organics and food waste from landfills statewide, among a number of other things. It's paired with an investment in composting infrastructure to help meet that diversion goal. But the big part of it, the big part that we're really interested in, is that cities will be required to procure or obtain a certain amount of compost, mulch, and or energy products derived from organic waste. So as an example, under the current regulations, which there will be another regulation, an update to the regulation package coming in the next couple of months, but under the current regulations, a city like the city of Berkeley would be required to procure up to 14,000 cubic yards of compost per year. There is an asterisk to that number just because there are some choices available to Berkeley that would change that number. That amount of that 14,000 cubic yards of compost can cover about 107 acres in a 1-inch application. So it's a lot of compost, and cities do need to develop plans for this compost. There is flexibility in how they use that compost, and carbon farming should be a natural outlet to that. The cities themselves don't have to be the ones that use the compost. Other organizations can use the compost sort of in the name of that city. So other public agencies or even urban farms or community organizations could potentially get access to this compost through agreements with the city. And then lastly, just to kind of close out, and this truly deserves its own presentation, is there's a lot of momentum building around building a local regenerative food economy in the Bay Area, one that counters economic inequality, systemic racism, and food sovereignty issues. I recently listened into the All In Eats proposal for an Alameda County circular food economy. It was really eye-opening, and there's just so much opportunity to connect urban carbon farming with the emergence of an urban local food system. So here are the resources that I've mentioned. All of these resources are free. They can be downloaded as PDFs on our website, stopwaste.org/gardening. We also have an upcoming virtual film screening of Symphony of the Soil. It's on November 19th. We also have an unscheduled, as of right now, worm composting webinar that will be happening in the winter. Registration for these are on our website. We have much more resources that are available if you just kind of scroll around through our website. Oh, by the way, in Symphony of the Soil, I haven't seen Kiss the Ground yet, but my understanding is that there are a lot of similarities, and Symphony of the Soil it just has some amazing footage of things happening in the soil ecosystem. So I recommend folks checking it out. Other than that, I just can't fit in everything I'd like to share in this short period of time, but there's our website again. There's myself with my email address. Please reach out and ask more questions if you have any, and I'm happy to talk to folks right now during the Q&A. Thank you.
Trevor, that was awesome. Great. Well, go ahead. Anybody who has a question for Trevor, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask Trevor any questions about his program. Very cool. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The way I compost at home, I just take compost out of the kitchen scraps, dig a hole in the ground, dump it in, and everywhere there's a bare spot in the garden. Is there any hope that that helps? I mean, it's so easy and dumb and stupid that I'm thinking that it might be a popular way to do it for people who don't have room to create a big compost pile and go to a lot of effort and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem to make our plants grow better.
Yeah, well, because we have, we are huge advocates of compost. We, as an agency, definitely want to promote the commercial compost that's coming through, food scraps and plant diversion of, through the green bin program. But we always say that the highest quality compost is the compost that you make yourself at home. Just last weekend, we taught a backyard composting webinar. So we have a ton of resources on folks who are home gardeners that want to compost themselves. That Tools for Building Healthy Soil is probably a better resource for a home gardener that wants to compost at home. But if there's folks that really want a deep dive into composting, that on-farm composting toolkit might satisfy that itch of just diving deeper into home composting. But just be aware that it is written for larger compost systems like for an urban farm, but home gardeners can certainly make use of it still.
Do you know anything about barrels that turn composting? I have a friend up in Seattle who has one. I'm thinking about getting it because rats don't bother it. It's like a sideways barrel. Do you know about those?
Is it like a modified version of a tumbler system?
Yeah, but it's one that you actually roll on the ground.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. We don't have them down here yet.
I will say that I'm not a big fan of tumbler systems. I don't know exactly what you're referring to. It sounds like just a modified tumbler.
It has a little door on it. Yeah, sounds like it is.
My one issue with tumblers is that they come with a couple of common problems. The first thing is that they over aerate sometimes, and they can quickly dry out, which can lead to some problems. They're also, since they're lifted off the ground, they can exclude a whole host of decomposers that you really want in the decomposition process for a compost system. It can be successful. I'm not saying it's not, because a lot of people do find success with tumblers. If you're a beginner composter, I don't recommend using a tumbler for the issues that could possibly come up. But you're right, you do need a compost system that keeps pests out like rats. As long as your system, like there are plastic bins that can keep rats out, that as long as it has a bottom and a top, it should be okay. And if you have a wood bin that you built yourself, definitely use a 1/4-inch hardware wire to line the bottom or any sides that you think have gaps that could allow critters in there that you don't want.
Thanks.
I have a question about, this follows on a question that was in the chat about the purity of commercial compost or city obtained compost. And the question on the chat was, does it contain persistent toxic chemicals? So that, and I'd like to add to that what was in the chat. I have used compost that's, sort of been processed by cities and dumped into areas, and, you're welcome to come and get it. And that particular compost smelled like it had been burned, and it smelled like burnt plastic. So I don't think that's something that we want to put in our soils. So I'm sorry, can you address that as a question? Sorry.
Yes. And it's something that Stop Waste can get very furious about. We're constantly talking with compost producers about the quality of their compost. And I won't lie, SB 1383 with this statewide rollout of compost infrastructure, communities like in Alameda County, we've been doing composting for a long, curbside composting for a long time. But there are communities in California now that are going to be rapidly rolling out these systems that haven't had the education around proper sorting and things. So there are some questions with SB 1383 and how the quality of compost that comes from these new infrastructure what the quality will be. So it's definitely an issue that we need to monitor. There's a couple other responses. So a compost producer, in order for me to recommend a compost from a commercial site, it should be certified either by the CDFA. The CDFA has a compost, like an organic compost quality thing, and OMRI, which is the Organic Materials Review Institute. It should be, the compost from a commercial facility should be certified by one of those two certifications. If it's not, I would be wary, and you should always be able to ask a compost vendor, a commercial vendor, for a compost lab analysis. And the lab analysis will tell you a couple things. The number one thing I would look at is the maturity. So what you said, that smell, that didn't smell right, maybe even smelled like plastic, that's really alarming. But if a compost has smells of ammonia or like rot, that's a sign of an immature compost. And in that case, I would let that pile sit for at least 3 to 4 months so that it could finish the decomposition process before you would ever use that on a soil. So vendors should be able to answer those questions, especially if they're OMRI or CFA certified. So, and with, I know this is kind of rambling on, so maybe I'll leave it at that. But if you have more questions, you can reach out to me via my email.
It looks like Marianne has her hand up. Did you get to ask your question, Marianne?
Sorry, I asked the question. I forgot to lower my hand. Thank you.
You're good. Okay. Looks like there's a question in the chat about what the second certification, OMRI, I guess. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so there's OMRI. It's the organization is the Organic Materials Review Institute. And there's a bunch of things that OMRI looks at, including contamination, make sure that there's minimal contamination. OMRI is an organic certification. So if an organic farm wants to use a commercially made compost, an OMRI certification is a step towards allowing that compost to be used as an organic farm. And to my understanding, the CDFA certification, which stands for the California Department of Food and Ag, they have their own organic certification for compost. And I believe it's more stringent than the OMRI certification. So if I see a compost that has a CDFA certification, that's usually a good sign.
Great. Janet, did you get a chance to ask your question? Maybe yours could be the last question.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Trevor, for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is a follow-on, and I mistakenly sent it to you personally, but my homeowners association is at a point where we're re-looking at our landscape. After 20 years of kind of the Storybook, front lawn with the, pretty bushes and stuff like that, that takes up an enormous amount of water, does zero for carbon sequestration, and that could do further. I wonder if you have some recommendations for how we can migrate and transition that to be a more carbon, sequestered and more environmentally sound and sustainable landscape.
Yeah, there's a few HOAs that we've worked with, and back when the drought was pushing a conversation around sheet mulching to do lawn conversions to drought tolerant gardens, a number of HOAs partnered with us to help them make that transition of how do we get away from the lawn to a different type of landscape. My recommendation that worked really well for them is partner with the landscape designer and come up with some come up with some like preset designs that members of the HOA can easily access, and have a plant list that of plants that are hopefully natives or drought tolerant plants, mostly perennials, so that they have deep roots that are putting carbon in the soil. And especially if it's a lawn conversion, use sheet mulching as the technique to convert that lawn to the drought tolerant garden. Sheet mulching uses an organic weed barrier like cardboard. It uses compost and it uses mulch, and those materials will decompose over time, feed the soil microbes that are partnering with your plant roots to create the carbon sequestration. And partner with a landscape designer, come up with some pre-designs for residents, and then maybe even do some have some community conversations to see what community members want. And it might be challenging to convince them to move away from the lawn, but it is really important nowadays. And you might hear that lawns can sequester a decent amount of carbon, but the amount of water and other resources that they require is not worth it, in my opinion. And a lot of that data, we're using shallow soil samples where they're just looking at carbon in the top layers of the soil, but we know through deeper soil sampling that it's not necessarily true, that for carbon sequestration to really happen, carbon needs to get deeper in the soil, and perennial plants are the best for that.
Thanks, Trevor. We'll leave it there for now. And I think we'll have time for more questions at the end, but now let's transition from carbon sequestration in the soil to carbon sequestration in trees. So I'd like to welcome up Amos White, who is our Vice Chair of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, and also the founder of 100,000 Trees for Humanity. So Amos, are you there? Are you able to share your screen?
Well, hello and welcome. Again, my name is Amos White. I am Vice Chair of Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, but I also wear many hats. My colleague here, both on the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, Ruth, and I serve in the city of Alameda on CASA, which is Community Action for a Sustainable Alameda. It's Alameda's, the city of Alameda's environmental task force. Very similar to what we're doing here, but specifically in Alameda, a coalition of environmental groups there. I have only shortly been directly involved in the environmental movement. I kind of got brought into it when I was organizing against the most recent administration after the passage of the Muslim ban in January of 2017. I was organizing with a group called ACLU, and we had sprung up across the nation over 2,000 chapters overnight to defend against, if you will, the police working with ICE. And in our organizing, I noticed a very common similarity or intersection of things over the course of the next 5 months, where we were doing work with immigrants and dealing with the issues of migration and looking at the root causes of it as that started that year, that huge migration of the train of people coming out of central Mexico up towards the US. And that's when I noticed that at the core of a lot of the aggression of this administration and what was driving, impacting both us here locally and across the globe, and what's climate. And that was a principal driver, even a principal cause of this administration pulling us out of the Paris Agreement to be able to do something about the climate. And so I really started with the help of a friend and through CASA, focusing on a strategy to not unite, but to begin to mobilize people at the individual level. I noticed that all the marketing messages and advertisements, it used to be you show a poor child with flies all around them on the ground on the dirt in Africa, and it mobilized the whole world to raise millions and hundreds of millions of dollars feed third world countries and to start food programs. But now they had shown an image of a polar bear on the last knob of ice for dozens of miles, and it was clear from their report that polar bear was not going to make it and would probably drown trying to find the next patch of ice because of global warming and the evaporating, if you will, ice caps. And the lack of response for people to have a like kind, if you will, reaction as we used to 20, 30 years ago gutted me. That the world really just didn't jump and begin to mobilize around this climate crisis. And I thought I'd try to work more at the individual level and came up with a strategy after reading an article on psychology. And I can't remember the title of the article, and somebody please share it with me, or if you know it, put it in the chat. But it had to do with a psychologist who had worked most recently on the climate change at the federal level, advising Congress. And she's a psychologist who works with severely depressed individuals. And she said two important things in her interview. It was in like Ms. Magazine 1 year ago in September or August of last year, just before the climate strike. And I read that she said, in working with severely depressed individuals, there are two key things you need to do. And it all has to do with rewiring our brains. And she says, we need to move people from their current state to a state of, if you will, more normalcy. And in doing so, people need to have a sense of agency over one thing. That means they need to feel that they can control one thing in their life before them. And two, that one thing just simply has to give them back, excuse me, positive feedback or a pleasurable return or experience. Just one thing. And I thought, that's not way too easy, but every time I kept thinking, it just hit me, kept hitting me like a ton of brick. And I woke up about a week later and I just kept thinking about that strategy. And every time I do it, even now, I keep doing the same thing and my hand keeps popping out. And every time my hand popped out, I saw a tree in it, a small sapling. And that's when that's what I think we need to do. We just need to put one tree in every person's hand globally. So it sounds really simple, but when you look at the data, scientists are saying we really do need to plant ourselves out of this, not as the sole strategy, but as Debbie was saying, from an implementation standpoint, from a root standpoint, we need to be banking this carbon using natural solutions. And that's where I came up with 100,000 trees. In working with our climate action plan in Alameda, our climate action plan called for 1 new tree per capita resident. We currently have 70,000, 78,000, almost 80,000 residents by the end of 2030. That's our goal, 10 years. And 1 new tree per capita resident would be 80,000 trees. And I thought, and that's on average, which means as you go on average, that's at the top of the dial. And I said, that's 80,000, which means if it were really maxed it out here in Alameda, this little island city of only 10.4 square miles of land, we could do 160,000, but no, we got buildings and roads and it's not sustainable. So we probably could do, if I thought about an 80-20 distribution, if that's average, we could probably add another 20% in terms of trees, and that would be 20,000 trees. And I thought that's what we need to do and call this. We're going to call it 100,000 trees for humanity. And so it's a carbon sequestration, urban reforestation solution. It's community driven in terms of a strategy. We seek to use a community organizing model to accelerate climate action plan goals, to sequester carbon by connecting people to the planet 1 tree at a time. So we started here in Alameda by pulling together folks. Again, it's community organizing model, but we created a diverse body, architects, designers, if you will, people in our architectural preservation group, urban gardeners, representatives from the Sierra Club, a labor a couple people in the labor movement focusing on jobs, justice, and climate. We have folks here in blue strategies working on blue strategies, meaning water-based strategies, but everything from kelp farming to other strategies that also sequester farming or carbon. And we pulled these groups together to actually say, how can we get 100,000 trees started and planted here in Alameda? How can we be the start of the mobilization movement? And just by mentioning the title, 100,000 Trees for Humanity, it was astounding how many people and how many literally individuals came forth saying, I want to plant a tree, or I want to help plant a tree. And we've just launched since then. Now, albeit we started our strategy in December, and yes, we got hit in March, April with shelter in place. So that really put the brakes on us. But we've stayed moving forward, and as of this October, we're getting ready to plant our first trees here in Alameda. Now, our mission with 100,000 trees is to simply focus on urban trees and plants. If you look at the science, in the last 100 years alone, we've deforested over half of the world's total timber, total amount of trees. Out of, I believe, 5 trillion trees, we have harvested out over 2.6 trillion trees. It's astounding, and not just for the loss of the trees, but also for the loss of the capacity to sequester carbon, the capacity to create oxygen, the capacity for habitat, and how that destabilizes the earth. But we can be a part of that solution. Again, thinking again of what that psychologist said, of just one simple act that we can do. And so the problem is, we all know we have elevated levels of CO2, and our trees are dying off due to the stressors, if you will, of prolonged drought that's going on. And this has created an extreme unhealthy climate, whether it's been from the fires and the smokes of the Amazon or the Congo of just last year, both, and other fires that have been burning, the Arctic Circle, Australia, where 80% of the entire continent was burning simultaneously. And then most recently, the entire west coast of the United States, where over 2,216 fires, not just fires, small, but complexes of fires were burning simultaneously, has been unfathomable. But we know we can do something in terms of a solution, but we just need to act now. So in doing so, with 100,000 trees, we propose to increase the tree canopies here where we live. And that's by planting trees, and that creates more clean air, increases the capture of CO2, and restoring that habitat that we've deforested by building roads and buildings, and just basically cutting down trees. And that brings us closer to nature. Now, our goal as an organization, again, is to focus on accelerating our climate action plan, or ours is called a climate action and resiliency plan, but in accelerating those goals. And that's to get to 14.5 metric tons of carbon per year by having 100,000 trees. Now, these aren't all one tree type. We want to focus on multiple strategies, initially starting with planting trees, but we also want to help support those trees and the environment by creating or by using green strategies, and as I also mentioned, using blue strategies. That includes planting plants after trees equitably in our communities, and really focusing on equity where trees are not, like in our communities of color and our lower economic parts of town, so that there is greater, if you will, both green equity and wealth that can be experienced, and health and wellness by our community residents. We also want to promote urban farming, and thank you for speaking so well about the urban farming. And again, from an implementation standpoint, this is another strategy to increase, if you will, local fresh foods at home, to decrease trips to the store, and also, again, in terms of health. And we also, here, we are an island in Alameda, and we want to develop, or need to develop, our living shorelines in terms of restoring the marshlands to to anticipate the sea level rise we will incur, as well as other strategies in terms of marsh and beach grasses as well. We also brought on board, intentionally, we have in the East Bay here, a network of beekeepers. And we brought on board 3 beekeepers across town to actually look at strategically placing, if you will, a total of 3 million new bees over the next 10 years in hives across our city to help support, if you will, the pollination here with the trees and the amount of plants we will be planting. We will also focus on living moss walls, which have an enormous carbon sequestration capacity, even greater than planting a tree, as well as focusing on jobs and internships and stipends for residents and youth who we want to work with throughout this process. So, you know, the big question is, how do we get there? So it's not, it isn't as simple as we thought. And we spent about 2 months, 3 months organizing. We began last December in 2019 when we launched. We met twice in November after I had this brainstorm in September, October to really get it organized. And we decided we had announced in December after we pulled together our tree board and said, you know, who are our key stakeholders, whether it's going to be the city, where we're going to really plant street trees, or and in our parks and open space, and or will it be also our residents? Because there's over 80% of all the land is privately owned. So how can we bring them into the process to get trees planted on their properties as well? And then in January this year, we say 1 month after we announced that we're an organization, 1 month later in your organizing where you are, we had a rally for Alamedans to announce that we're moving forward to do our part to get to zero now. And that's to start the whole movement. And then on Earth Day, 3 months later, after we've had time to plan, organize, and promote this, we were to plant 10,000 trees on Earth Day alone. And I'm going to show you the strategy that we were going to use to get there. And our strategy was to get 10,000 volunteers. Yes, 10,000 volunteers, raise $10,000, and to plant 10,000 trees. Our plan, we kept it simple. We have twofold track. One is to do mass plantings, and that's the 10K trees per year to get us to 100,000 trees. Our second is to plant with the city as a collaborator, municipal street trees in parks. And that was going to be a longer arc. And we actually had a meeting in January and got agreements to do 11 strategies across our city in planting in parks, supporting them in event plantings, doing street trees with them, even helping our city, which we did co-author, if you will, our master street tree plan, which was up for rewriting just this year as an organization. A subcommittee actually wrote that. But to focus on the mass plantings, we decided to keep it simple. We said we formed an alliance with Arbor Day Foundation to get 10,000 trees from them. And we came up with a strategy to, if we go door to door and make or ask people for a $10 donation, that would make them a member of 100,000 trees and also of Arbor Day Foundation. But that $10 per member, we would need 1,000 members in order to come up with $10,000. So we just had to find people who wanted to make a difference. And we engaged our city high school, Alameda High School and Encinal High School and some other high schools. And the kids were all fired up to get ready and go, just to raise those 1,000 members to get those donations. And so with each $10, Arbor Day said they would give us 10 free trees. So $1 per tree. And these are saplings or whips as they are called. So we would have raised our 10K for $1 a tree, and we would have our 10,000 trees ready to plant on Earth Day. And that's still our strategy, hopefully moving forward again as we come through shelter in place. To get there, we knew we need to organize into a team to actually make this successful. So from that group, that board I showed you, we had, we organized ourselves into an executive group. I'm the CPO of the team, Chief Planting Officer, if you will. We have a member from our Sierra Club tree team who founded it, Mr. Arthur Boone, who's our senior tree advisor, advising us and head of security or safety and security on planting days. And we have a strategic advisor as well, Ingrid Ballman, who really was focused on the design and helping us logistically understand and organize ourselves as an organization. We even have an operations group from head planner to a chief growth officer who's really focused on our development, meaning our financial development and fundraising, a chief tree officer who handles our website and IT, and then an event coordinator on day of, who is our one of our partners of our physical sponsor, Common Vision. And then on the activities on those mass plantings, we knew we needed site coordinators across the city. We broke up our city into 5 zones, and we needed a site coordinator in each one of those zones in order to liaison with the massive volunteers that we had. We had master gardeners on hand, arborists, and we even most recently are working with bringing on board a forester. We have one forester on board, but one that is specifically focused as a data scientist to do mapping, if you will, of the trees in locations to help accelerate, if you will, whether it's shading goal or other, but based on data science. And so our Earth Day goal of 10K trees, as I said, this is a community organizing strategy, and it takes plenty of volunteers. We were raising 50 coordinators that we were having across the city. We were bringing on board event and food sponsors for that day, even equipment sponsors. That's a lot of shovels. We are asking people to bring their own shovels when we do have plantings, but in terms of getting this implemented, we want to make sure we have everything there for folks as well, as far as training and even our own COVID policy in terms of social distancing protocols that we're following from our county here as well. And coordinating very closely with our city public works and our police department so that people stay safe, not drifting off in the streets, but in making sure traffic is aware where we are doing street tree planting as well. Again, I can't hammer this home enough. This is a community-based organizing strategy. We engaged a myriad of organizations, our environmental group, Costa. We engaged even our faith community so that they can take the message back that we're planting 100,000 trees for the planet right here, so they can take it back to their own, if you will, congregations and communities. Our county-based Office of Education we liaisoned with in our own local school district, as well as other groups, like I said, our backyard growers and our architectural groups, so that all these parties were brought in as stakeholders to understand the process and to be able to be further our message as we work towards and down our mission. Lastly, I would say, or not even lastly, but again, in so doing, we need key stakeholders. And so our partners and friends in this, first and foremost, our suppliers of trees for the whips are the Arbor Day Foundation. For our volunteers, I was fortunate enough to meet at a random engagement in December as we were all formulating this, an organization which is kind of like the United Way of Volunteers here in the Bay Area. It's called One Brick Foundation. They literally supply thousands of volunteers at a time, or hundreds of volunteers at a time even, for our local marathons and large scale events. And they said they'd be happy to, if you will, turbocharge our mass plantings. And key, and most key, I would say, in all of this as we're doing this, is having a close relationship with our city. In sitting down with them, we met with our Parks Department, the head of our Public Works Department, our Assistant City Manager, and their respective staff. Our arborist was there, our Parks and Rec staffers were there, people who work there. And we made our presentation in case for how we as the community are moving forward with this and how we'd like to work in collaboration with them. And we were really met with, after a good hour-and-a-half meeting, open arms and a list of, if you will, objectives that they needed support with across our city. So we encourage you to do the same where you live. And definitely our Parks and Recs department, as they control, if you will, the majority of the green space and large open spaces here that also still need a lot of support with trees that they're planting. The most important part in planting is not just getting the tree in the ground, which is important, but it's actually the follow-on, what is called maintenance. For those of you not familiar with it, maintenance means watering the tree. The maintenance schedule after you plant a tree in the first year is watering that tree once a week for the first year. And that needs to be done either by your city or by the adjacent private property owner, meaning the house in front of that tree. If you engage that property owner to actually take care of that tree, which is a strategy we're working on, and or two, whether it's not with your organization, like 100,000 trees, where we are mapping every tree we're planting. The ones the cities don't take care of, we're actually, we'll have our own, if you will, process to maintain those trees. So in the first year, it's once a week. In the second and third years, all the way to the end of the third year, you have to maintain those trees, at least meaning watering them sufficiently once a month, especially here in California. And so that's a key focus of that we want to make sure that each tree comes to a state of fruition or success. The benefits, as we said, getting 100,000 trees after the end of 10 years is really removing that carbon out of the atmosphere. It's cleaner air, which a lot of people don't know. Trees actually filter particulate matter from the air, having this onslaught of wildfires here in the West. And yes, as far as Maine, the smoke, I mean, globally, obviously, the smoke has traveled in the atmosphere. But people in the Midwest and friends in Maine even could specifically cite that they had more, if you will, redder sunsets. And smoke was falling somewhere with friends, either in Michigan or Ohio. I forget where it was. I was catching that on Facebook and comments that were being followed there after our wildfires here, or which are some are still going, but not to the degree that they were just 1 month ago. So trees are enormously beneficial in providing these benefits, definitely for more native habitat, for increased rainwater absorption from the roots that they actually sink into the ground, and their biomass of the trees and trunks and that they have, and involving our youth, literally starting now, engaging them to actually put their hands in the soil and be connected, if you will, to the planet as the solution, that they too can make a difference and feel good about that and want to do it again, as we're going to be doing this every year in our pre-rainy season, starting in October, and then we'll have another planting. I know 100,000 trees will having a second planting in January, which is the height of our rainy season, and then lastly in a third one around Earth Day again. And this creates a more resilient community, being focused as a community organizing strategy. The impact, as we all know, is we all come together, and it's resiliency that we get in the end. Greener neighborhoods, reduction in energy costs from the shading that this provides. We're banking our carbon and we're cooling our planet. And really, more importantly, we're really hitting the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. 100,000 trees hits 5 of those goals, which is goal number 11. Excuse me, goal numbers 11, 3, 2, 13, 15, and 14 that we do solve. Goal 11 is the sustainable cities and communities. Goal number 3 is good health and well-being, from the green canopy and the neurological effects of biophilia that people, that we all have by de-stressing around a green and natural environment, to this goal number 2 of zero hunger, where we're actually getting more food in terms of the gardens planted. Goal number 15 with life on land, really just getting trees back into the ground. And goal number 14, life below water, are blue strategies with kelp farms that we have being strategized out for planting, as well as including mussels and oysters as part of that for filtering out water as well. And this is all to get to zero carbon emissions by 2030 across our island. But really, it's not just our island. We've been, as I said, fortunate by word of mouth. Our adjacent city of San Leandro, almost the same size as Alameda, has extended an MOU to us to plant 100,000 trees across San Leandro, as well as our county in our unincorporated areas. And most recently, we've been selected to a very large and generous grant to plant over initially 2,000 trees just across the estuary of our island over in East Oakland. So we're off like a rocket. But again, it's keeping it simple, giving people one thing that they can do that they can have a sense of agency over. And that's 100,000 trees for humanity. And we're ready to grow. This is our implementation strategy to launch, if you will, the carbon sequestration movement and connect people to planet, one tree at a time. I'll
Hey,
take
Amos,
questions. Yeah.
you know, we're running a little short of time and there are some questions in the chat.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm
I'll open
wondering
up
if we
and see
can
what
kind
they
of
are.
move on to Anthony's presentation, and then we can certainly stick around and take some more questions at the end, and perhaps you can also answer some of those questions in the chat. But given that we're kind of running out of time, I did want to give Anthony Meant an opportunity to talk about his project, the Zero Footprint Project, that is really going to accelerate a lot of these carbon sequestration projects to the next level. So we'll hand it over to Anthony. And Anthony, are you able to share your screen?
I think so. Let me give it a shot.
Great.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Ben, Trevor, and Amos for your great work. I think we're hearing a lot about different kind of strategies for what people are doing in terms of like technical expertise and implementation in the field. And so I think right now I'm hoping to, in a way, let me see if I can, are you guys seeing my screen right now?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, cool. Sorry, that took me a second. Too many windows open. But really looking for a way for how we can kind of think bigger and create a renewable food economy and kind of scale up a lot of efforts, you know, that we've already seen and heard are taking root in different communities. And so, you know, there's a lot of text, but I think just a quick note, like we're all concerned about climate, this climate emergency task force. And in some cases, there's a question of like, why food? And so according to the UN, there are only 60 remaining harvests at the current rate of soil depletion. And so that's like quite, you know, grounding. I think it's not just like a hypothetical, food and climate are intertwined, but food is also a huge potential solution. And so Trevor has, you know, said some numbers before that are really incredible. You know, things like 1.5 tons of carbon per acre per year. I think some of that research is showing that like rangeland compost application can do that for 10 to 30 years from one compost application. You know, and he mentioned like 47 tons of carbon in 1 acre at the Fremont project. Globally, there's 8 billion acres of farmland and grassland. And so it's like such a tremendously huge opportunity that really I feel like the climate movement has not even begun to like adequately prioritize. The challenge, of course, is the cost. And so like, you know, in some of these discussions earlier, Trevor mentioned like compost application on 10 acres at Altamont. So far, you know, going on 100 next year, et cetera. But to apply compost, you know, to create it, transport it, and apply it is maybe $600, maybe $1,000 per acre, depending on the logistics and different aspects. And so this fundamentally, I think, can come down to a question of like, how do we fund this, you know? And so somebody mentioned in the plenary drawdown, I don't know if people in this breakout are familiar with this, but there's a really great project drawdown that has identified like 80 to 100 climate solutions. And for each one, it has estimated the plausible adoption rate, the cost and the benefit to society, both in terms of net savings and net profit for the industries involved. And so, you know, I want to point out, first of all, it shifts the psychology for me, particularly of climate from anxiety, et cetera, to like total optimism and proactivity, because according to drawdown, you know, between now and 2050, we need to remove some, you know, 1 trillion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. That would cost $29 trillion to do that at the plausible rate for every single industry, whether it's like educating girls or reducing food waste or solar panels or, you know, regenerative ag. But $29 trillion is just 1% of GDP. And so, you know, for everybody who's a city planner, a policymaker, you know, yes, let's like focus on like the actual strategies and think about all these things, but really it kind of comes down to, okay, how do we mobilize money? Like, you know, drawdown will illustrate if there's 80 or 100 solutions, you know, there's no one single silver bullet, so to speak, but in fact, there kind of is a silver bullet. It's money. And so it's like, how do we move the money? And so we've already covered some of carbon farming and compost, so I'll skip that. My path to some of this work is in the restaurant industry. We started doing pop-ups in 2008 in San Francisco. Before that was even a term. It turned into a restaurant in New York, among other places, called Mission Chinese Food that miraculously won New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012. We then found ourselves in all kinds of global celebrity chef conferences and things. And after we had a daughter, just started to think about trying to mobilize the food industry towards climate solutions. And so in 2019, we began a collaboration with California Air Resources Board and the Department of Food and Agriculture to really scale carbon farming and bring funding and awareness to these kinds of solutions. So there's a bunch of restaurants involved. You can find all this information at our website. But the way that we're kind of activating a funding mechanism is by getting restaurants to add a 1% charge on the check. And then for that money to go towards carbon farming. Another way you could imagine this happening is, a waste hauler adding $1 per month on the bill. These kind of initiatives could begin as an opt-in, for example, and in a given region, maybe 10,000 residents opt in, then 20, then 50. And eventually there starts to be like the political groundwork to make it more of a new normal through policy. And so this slide is kind of a little visual on what we're thinking, but I think the best analogy here really is to kind of take the playbook of what is happening in renewable energy in over 100 cities and counties and countries where, basically people have committed to 100% renewable. And, that is not through individuals like taking out a loan from the bank, putting up a few solar panels on their roof. There's way too many logistical barriers to that kind of internalized effort. Maybe they don't own the building. Maybe they don't have access to the finances. Maybe they're just too lazy or tired. They don't have the expertise to like build that solar installation on their roof, all the things we know. Instead, there's a system that we know pretty simply as improving the grid. That concept is pretty new. That only really began like 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think that the global science on carbon farming and regenerative agriculture is making the case that it is as big or maybe even a much bigger opportunity than the entire energy sector. And so I'm making the case that we need similar economic frameworks to improve the grid when it comes to farmland as well. And so this, again, could be 1% at restaurants. This could be $1 on the waste hauling bill, but really to create collective action through choice architecture and to create the economic frameworks through, a combination of citizens and policy and everybody kind of coming together around an organizing framework, and working with Ben and the RCDs and doing carbon farming in their backyard and using some of that money for urban forestry and all the different solutions that we've heard today. But really, rather than have it be like, Amos bending over backwards to try to raise $10,000, and bring stakeholders together, we need a new normal where like, the climate emergency plan is we're going to send 1% of like county revenue and county GDP towards these solutions. So the collaboration that we started is with the California Resource Conservation Districts. And so I had not met Ben before. We're sort of like getting to know, like we've made a collaboration with the overarching CRCD, and then we're working with like each individual RCD, which as Ben mentioned, there's a wide range of how they operate and who's funding them and what capacity they are at and what, level of familiarity with carbon farming. But overall, the goal that we're envisioning is to sort of almost create like regional healthy soil programs to complement the statewide effort. And so we just really began this in earnest in January, but we've awarded 6 grants for about $100,000, and we've raised another $400,000 for targeted carbon farming programs in Sonoma County and San Mateo County for the rest of Q4 in 2021. And so there's tons of information at our website, which is zerofoodprint.org. This is a complicated overview of the grant making process. I'm going to just skip this in the interest of time, but this deck is available in a folder that Ruth has. And so I want to get really quickly, somebody mentioned like climate action plans in Alameda and has already started to incorporate carbon sequestration. And so I really am hoping that if anybody on this call is working on a regional climate action plan, basically going back to this like complicated grant process, we can navigate this and help you optimize your carbon sequestration. Excuse me. And yeah, I'll skip the details again in the interest of time. But then, as Trevor brought up, SB 1383 is already happening basically, and people in different municipalities are preparing for it. And so it's ramping up statewide organic matter diversion from 10% to 75%. And so that's like, a massive change on the creation of compost and organic matter along those lines, like mulch and other things. And then Trevor also mentioned some procurement requirements. And I think if you kind of back out the math, it's pretty close to like $1 per resident of procurement. And so, again, if ballpark, you can also imagine about another $1 per resident or, per resident's worth of compost to transport and apply that compost onto a farm or rangeland. And so, depending on your jurisdiction, your region, if you're going to buy the compost, we would love to work with you and fundraise the other $1, to try to get that onto a farm and ranch to do carbon farming in your region and make progress on your climate action plan. And if you need help, kind of with that initial $1 to fund it, I mean, you can imagine a campaign with like 20 restaurants adding 1% and citizens knowing that, by going to those restaurants, they're supporting climate action and local carbon farming, each restaurant generating about $10,000 per year. And here's like $200,000 that can help towards your procurement requirement, or depending on the size of your region, cover the entire procurement requirement. So overall, I think what Zero Foodprint and Restore California are doing is kind of like optimally bringing money in from outside of government budgets and kind of enabling citizens to create a circular and renewable economy. And this is kind of like a flow chart of what that would look like, though again, it's a little bit wonky. So basically, if anybody is actually like a policymaker trying to solve these issues, please get in touch and we would love to work with you on it. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to like go back to any slides or answer any questions, but I don't know what our time constraints are here.
That was great, Anthony, and thank you for kind of making you keep up the pace there. Very good information. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. There have been quite a few Q&A back and forth in the chat. Let's just bring all of our panelists together. So if folks have specific questions for Anthony, please go ahead and you can unmute yourself. Ooh, as the street sweeper goes by. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, or continue to ask in the chat if anybody has any questions. Go ahead.
Hey, Anthony, I know we've been talking a little bit. We have private text. This is John Connors. Do you know of anybody who's taking these climate action plans to local Green New Deal initiatives, especially as your industry has been almost wiped out with, the restaurant industry has been almost wiped out with COVID closures? Is there any local California jurisdictions who are putting the money where their mouth is and, activating green jobs?
I'm not that in touch with the regional governments. I'm trying to form those relationships and partnerships, so I can't speak towards that. However, COVID has destroyed government budgets too. And so when you're kind of saying like people putting their money where their mouth is, there's no money in any budgets, and so that's kind of why we need citizens and individuals to kind of work together on a collective funding mechanism if we're going to make any climate progress. In a way, you have like 1 million people marching, like somebody do something about climate, and like what would that even be except for the government taxing you and then using that to varying degrees of effectiveness. So to me, it's kind of like, well, for those of us who care about it, for those of us who would support businesses working on climate solutions, we can basically self-organize and start funding those solutions that create local benefit.
Well said. Thank you.
Any other questions for Anthony? Any other questions for our panelists? So wanted to have the opportunity to really thank the wonderful presentations that you heard from Ben and Trevor and Amos and Anthony. Really, really good content. And we will be able to share the presentation materials and also the recording on our website. So take a look at that. We'll be in touch via email from the registration portal. So any last questions as we're winding up here?
I'd just like to say thank you to the people who planned this and the amazing presenters I heard. You guys all rock. It's amazing what you all just collectively shared that the whole world needs to hear. Thank you. This is Sheila Jacobs. So inspired.
All righty, well, that's it for now. Please check out the chat. It's a very rich resource. I'm going to try and save it. And thank you again, everyone. And we'll migrate back over to the main room.